They didn't lower their voices. They didn't have to. My brother laughed. My partner looked away. My mother said, "Let it go," like I was the problem. It was a room full of people who knew my name, and still decided I didn't matter. What they didn't know, what you know, is that I was holding something that could change every face in that room. Not a threat, not revenge. The truth. A truth that would turn that laughter into panic. That would make silence finally mean something. So if you've ever been dismissed, talked over, or quietly erased by the people closest to you, stay with me. Because the moment they realize who I really am is the moment everything breaks, and nothing goes back to the way it was. My name is Elena Brooks, and in my family, nobody ever asked who I wanted to be. They decided early, quietly, almost efficiently. At birthdays, at holidays, at those long Sunday dinners where nothing important was ever said out loud, everyone had a part to play. My parents never called it that, of course. They'd say things like, "That's just how you are," or, "Every family needs balance." But it was a system, a hierarchy, and once you were placed, you didn't move. My older sister Marissa was the obvious one, the star. She entered rooms like she expected applause and usually got it. She talked fast, laughed loud, and told stories where she was always at the center, always impressive, always one step ahead of everyone else. Teachers loved her. Relatives remembered her name. Strangers felt like friends within minutes. If Marissa failed, it was called ambition. If she succeeded, it was proof she was destined for more. And then there was me. I wasn't called a failure. That would have been too honest. I was called the helper. It sounds harmless when you hear it for the first time. Almost kind. The helper. The reliable one. The person who fills in the gaps so everything else works. But helpers don't shine. They don't interrupt. They don't take up space. They just make sure everyone else looks good. I was the one who carried plates back to the kitchen before anyone asked. The one who stayed behind to clean when conversations got interesting. The one my parents would glance at and say, "Elena will handle it." Handle what, exactly, was never specified. But I handled it. I learned early that praise wasn't for effort. It was for performance. And my performance was silence. My skill was not needing much. My success was not becoming a problem. At school, teachers described me as pleasant. Not smart. Not gifted. Pleasant. When relatives asked what I was doing with my life, my parents answered for me. "Elena works some office job downtown," my father would say, already turning to talk to someone else. Some office job? Downtown. It became a phrase that followed me like a shadow. Vague enough that nobody asked questions. Small enough that it didn't compete with Marissa's stories. Safe. I never corrected them. Not because I was ashamed, but because every time I tried, something strange happened. People stopped listening. Their eyes would drift. Someone would interrupt. A phone would come out. A new topic would appear like a rescue rope, pulling the room away from me before I finished my sentence. So I stopped trying. Silence, I learned, keeps the peace. And peace was cheaper than honesty. Or so I thought. Years passed like that. Quietly. I showed up. I smiled. I agreed. At family gatherings, Marissa would recount her latest achievement, her latest struggle, her latest triumph over something dramatic. Everyone leaned in. My mother nodded with pride. My father filled in details like a proud narrator. And then someone would turn to me and ask, almost as an afterthought, "So Elena, still at that office job?" I would nod. Yes. Not because it was true, but because it was easier than explaining why it wasn't. There's a strange loneliness in being underestimated for so long that people stop imagining you differently. It's not loud. It doesn't announce itself. It settles in your chest slowly, like something heavy you carry without realizing how much it weighs. You start shrinking your answers. You start editing yourself before anyone else can. You learn which parts of you are safe to show and which ones only complicate things. I became very good at that. At being agreeable. At being useful. At disappearing in plain sight. Even outside my family, the role followed me. At work, people assumed I was support staff. In group conversations, I was the one taking notes, not leading discussions. Friends came to me for help, advice, emotional labor, but rarely to celebrate me. And I let them. Because correcting people takes energy. And when you've spent years being gently pushed aside, you start to believe that energy might be wasted on you. What no one ever noticed was how carefully I listened, how much I observed, how often I was underestimated by people who never thought to look twice. There's power in that, though I didn't understand it at first. When people think you're small, they reveal themselves. They speak freely. They don't guard their words. I heard things I wasn't supposed to hear. I noticed patterns others missed. I learned who relied on me, quietly while pretending I didn't matter. But none of that fit the role they'd assigned me. So none of it counted. The helper isn't meant to surprise anyone. The helper exists to support the story, not become it. That's what my family believed. And for a long time, I believed it too. Until I didn't. It wasn't one dramatic moment. No argument. No explosion. Just a slow realization that crept in during quiet nights and long commutes. The understanding that the version of me my family talked about wasn't incomplete by accident. It was convenient. As long as I stayed the helper, no one had to adjust. No one had to feel threatened. No one had to reconsider the roles they'd grown comfortable with. And I was rewarded for staying small. With approval. With peace. With being included, as long as I didn't take up too much space. So I played the part. I smiled when my accomplishments were minimized. I nodded when my work was reduced to vague phrases. I swallowed the urge to explain myself. Because every time I considered telling the truth, I pictured the moment it would land in the room. The sudden shift. The recalculation in their eyes. The discomfort. And I wasn't ready for that yet. There's a lie at the center of my family's story about me. A simple one. A quiet one. It's not something I invented. It's something I allowed. And for years, that lie kept everything stable. Predictable. Calm. But lies have weight. And roles have limits. And there comes a moment when staying silent no longer feels like peace, but like erasure. I didn't know then how close that moment was, only that the role they gave me was built on something they never bothered to ask about, and I was done correcting them. For now. Here's the part you know before anyone else does. The moment I stopped correcting them wasn't gradual. It was a single sentence. 5 years ago, on a warm evening that should have felt ordinary, my mother and I were standing outside our house talking to a neighbor. The kind of conversation that floats on small smiles and borrowed politeness. The neighbor asked how her daughters were doing. It was an easy question, one my mother had answered dozens of times before. She spoke about Marissa first, of course. She always did. Marissa was thriving. Marissa was ambitious. Marissa was busy doing important things. My mother's voice lifted as she talked, pride filling in the spaces between her words. I stood beside them, holding my keys, half listening, already preparing the polite nod I'd perfected over the years. Then the neighbor smiled at me and asked, "And Elena?" There was a pause. Not long, but long enough. My mother laughed lightly and said, "Oh, Elena never had Marissa's drive." She didn't lower her voice. She didn't glance at me. She said it like a fact everyone already understood. The neighbor nodded, the way people do when they don't know what else to say. The conversation moved on. Someone mentioned the weather. Someone else asked about traffic. And just like that, the moment passed. Except it didn't. I stood there, quiet, my face calm, my body still. Years of practice had trained me well. But something inside me cracked in a way that never fully closed again. It wasn't the cruelty of a sentence. It was the ease of it. The way my mother said it without hesitation. Without malice, as if she were explaining a difference in eye color or height, as if this was simply who I was, less driven, less intense, less. I smiled until the neighbor left. I said goodnight. I walked to my car. I closed the door, and that's where everything I'd been holding back finally collapsed. I cried alone in that car for a long time. Not the kind of crying that makes noise, the quiet kind, the kind where you press your hand to your mouth, so no one hears. The kind where your chest aches more than your eyes. I wasn't just hurt. I was humiliated. Not publicly. Internally. Because in that moment, I realized something devastating. My mother didn't just misunderstand me. She believed that version of me. She had accepted it as truth. And worse, she had shared it with the world as if it were settled. I replayed the sentence over and over. Elena never had Marissa's drive. Not doesn't. Never had. It erased my effort, my choices, my restraint. It reduced years of quiet discipline into a flaw. That night, sitting in my car with the engine off and my phone face down beside me, I made a promise to myself. Not out loud, not dramatically, just a quiet decision that settled deep in my bones. I would never beg to be seen again. Not by my mother, not by my family, not by anyone. I wouldn't explain myself. I wouldn't defend my ambition. I wouldn't correct the narrative they were comfortable with. If they couldn't see me standing right in front of them, then they didn't deserve access to the truth of who I was becoming. That promise felt dangerous even as I made it, not because it was angry, but because it was final. It closed a door I'd been standing in for years, hoping someone would notice me waiting. The regret didn't fade with time. It hardened. It turned into something solid and quiet, like stone forming under pressure. I stopped volunteering information about my life. I stopped shrinking explanations for other people's comfort. I stopped hoping that one day someone would say, "We were wrong about you." Hope, I learned, can be more painful than disappointment. Instead, I focused on control, on consistency, on becoming someone whose worth didn't require applause. Outwardly, nothing changed. I was still the helper, still agreeable, still present at family events with the same calm expression and careful words. But inwardly, a shift had occurred. I was no longer waiting. I watched my family the way you watch a story you already know the ending to, with curiosity, but no urgency to intervene. I listened when they spoke about me in shorthand, when they summarized my life into phrases that fit neatly into their expectations. And I let them, not because I believed them, but because correcting them would have required vulnerability. And I had decided that night in my car that vulnerability with the wrong people was too expensive. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being emotionally betrayed in a small, forgettable moment. No one else remembers it. No one else apologizes. The world moves on, unaware that something fundamental has shifted inside you. That sentence followed me everywhere after that. In meetings, in conversations, in moments when I could have stepped forward and didn't. Sometimes I wondered if my mother would have said something different if I'd spoken up, if I'd laughed it off, if I'd corrected her. But the question always led to the same answer. She didn't ask. She didn't look. And that told me everything I needed to know. So I built a life that required less recognition. I learned to measure success privately. I found satisfaction in progress no one else noticed. I became meticulous, patient, strategic. I didn't burn bridges. I simply stopped crossing them. The regret didn't turn me bitter. It didn't turn me cruel. It sharpened me. It made me selective about where I invested my energy and my truth. But it also planted something else. A belief that would later challenge me in ways I couldn't yet predict. That belief was simple. If people only value what they can see, then sometimes it's safer to stay invisible. At the time, it felt like wisdom, like self-preservation. I didn't know then how heavy that belief would become, how it would follow me into decisions that weren't as clean as they felt, how staying silent could protect me, but also cost me. I didn't know that the promise I made that night would one day force me into a choice where silence would no longer be neutral. All I knew was that something inside me had settled into place. Not anger, not revenge, determination, quiet, patient, unyielding. And once that kind of resolve takes hold, it doesn't announce itself. It waits for the moment when staying quiet is no longer an option. Marissa's engagement party was held in Savannah, Georgia, inside a rented historic home that looked like it belonged on the cover of a magazine. Tall white columns framed the front porch. Soft string lights were draped between oak trees like someone had carefully choreographed the evening to feel magical. The kind of place where every photograph would look intentional, every moment curated to suggest happiness without effort. It was perfect, and that was the point. I arrived early as I always did, not because anyone asked me to, but because arriving early was part of the role I'd learned to play. The helper doesn't make an entrance. The helper makes things run. The house was quiet when I stepped inside. The floors creaked softly under my shoes, polished wood reflecting the late afternoon light. A catering staff member nodded at me like I belonged there, which I did, in a way that never required acknowledgement. My mother was already inside, adjusting centerpieces, her phone in one hand. She looked relieved when she saw me. "Good," she said. "You're here. No hello. No smile. Just relief. She handed me a stack of drink menus and gestured toward the back patio. Can you set these near the bar? And maybe make sure the ice is topped off. I nodded and took them without comment. It felt automatic. Familiar. Like slipping into a coat that had been hanging by the door my entire life. As guests began to arrive, the house filled with voices and movement. Laughter echoed off the high ceilings. Music played softly, chosen to sound effortless. I moved through the crowd with practiced invisibility, refilling glasses, wiping condensation from tables, redirecting lost guests toward the restrooms. Each task came with a smile and a casual assumption that I was available. That I would handle it. That I had nothing better to do. A distant cousin asked me where to place a gift. An aunt asked me to find more napkins. A family friend pressed an empty glass into my hand without looking at my face. None of it was cruel. That's what made it worse. Micro-humiliations don't announce themselves. They blend into the background. They pile up quietly, like dust you don't notice until the air feels heavy. When Marissa finally arrived, the energy in the room shifted. It was subtle, but undeniable. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Heads turned. Smiles widened. She stepped in like she belonged at the center of everything. Her dress caught the light just right. Her hair was styled perfectly, not a strand out of place. She laughed as if the world was already applauding. Caleb followed behind her. He wasn't flashy, didn't demand attention. He walked a half-step behind Marissa, scanning the room with calm eyes, taking everything in. He shook hands, smiled politely, and said little. The kind of man who listens before deciding what to say. When Marissa spotted me near the bar, she waved dramatically. "Elena!" she called, her voice carrying across the patio. I turned, already bracing myself. She looped an arm through mine and pulled me toward a group of her friends, none of whom I'd met before. Their smiles were curious, evaluative. They looked at me the way people look at someone whose relevance they're still deciding. "This is my sister Elena," Marissa said brightly. "She does paperwork for the city." The words landed softly, but they stung. Paperwork. For the city. Vague. Small. Dull. Someone laughed, not unkindly. Another nodded like that made sense. The group moved on, already turning their attention back to Marissa and her engagement story. I felt the old burn rise in my chest. The familiar heat of being reduced in public, of having your identity summarized in a way that makes you easier to dismiss. But I stayed quiet, because that's what helpers do. They absorb moments like this and keep moving. As the evening wore on, the pattern continued. Marissa held court. She retold the proposal story, each time with a slightly different emphasis, each time drawing fresh gasps and applause. Guests clinked glasses and praised her taste, her luck, her future. Caleb stood beside her, smiling, occasionally meeting my eyes across the room. Not often, but enough. When our eyes did meet, he didn't look away immediately. There was no pity in his expression, no amusement, just something observant. Like he was noticing the way I hovered near the edges, the way people handed me things instead of asking my name. At one point, my mother approached me with a forced smile. "Can you help Mrs. Langley find the restroom?" she asked, already turning away as if my answer was assumed. I guided the woman down the hallway, listening to her talk about how beautiful everything was, how lucky Marissa was to have such a big celebration. I nodded at the appropriate moments, my reflection flickering in framed mirrors as we passed. Later, someone spilled red wine near the dance floor. A voice called my name without hesitation. "Elena!" I knelt to blot the stain while laughter and music continued above me. From my position on the floor, I could see shoes. Expensive heels. Polished loafers. People stepping carefully around the mess I was cleaning. No one offered help. No one thanked me. I stood, smoothed my dress, and stepped back into the shadows. Near the end of the night, Marissa clinked her glass and asked for everyone's attention. She thanked her parents, her friends, her fiancé. She spoke about love and beginnings, and how lucky she felt to be surrounded by support. She didn't mention me. That wasn't unusual. It still hurt. As applause filled the patio, I caught Caleb watching me again. This time, his expression had changed. His brow furrowed slightly, like he was seeing something that didn't quite add up. After the speech, he approached me quietly. "Thanks for helping tonight," he said. "You've been doing a lot." The words were simple, polite, but they landed differently. Not as an obligation, as an observation. "You're welcome," I replied. He nodded, then hesitated, like he wanted to say more. Before he could, Marissa called his name, her voice sharp with impatience. He turned back to her, the moment slipping away. The party continued. The lights glowed brighter as the sky darkened. Laughter spilled into the night air. Everything looked exactly as it was supposed to, but something felt off. Not dramatic, just unsettled. As I gathered empty glasses near the edge of the patio, I overheard my mother speaking to one of Marissa's friends. "Elena's always been happy to help," she said. "She's just not the ambitious type." I froze for a second, then kept moving. The words followed me like a shadow as the night wound down. Nothing terrible happened at that party. No confrontation. No explosion. No moment anyone would point to later and say, "That's when it all went wrong." And that's what made it dangerous. Because beneath the string lights and soft music, something was shifting. Quietly, invisibly, a harmless moment can be the most revealing. A small dismissal can signal something much larger. As I left the house that night, stepping out into the warm Savannah air, I had the strange feeling that the role I'd been playing was about to be tested. And that this time, staying quiet might not protect me the way it always had. Marissa wasn't evil. That's what made everything more complicated. She wasn't cruel in the way stories like to make villains cruel. She didn't plot in dark corners or raise her voice to humiliate me outright. She smiled. She laughed. She hugged me in front of people. She introduced me as her sister with pride, threaded, just thin enough to look real. But beneath all of it lived something sharp and restless. Fear. Marissa had spent her entire life being exceptional. Not just praised, but defined by it. The smart one. The driven one. The future. Our parents didn't mean to make it a competition, but they didn't stop it either. And Marissa learned early that love came easiest when she stayed impressive. She was terrified of becoming ordinary. Terrified that one day, someone would stop clapping. And even more terrified of the idea that I, the quiet sister who carried plates and filled gaps, might be more than the role she'd assigned me. Because if I was more than the helper, then what did that make her? That fear followed her everywhere, especially into moments that were supposed to be hers. Engagements, celebrations, rooms full of witnesses. Those were the places where her identity had to be reinforced, polished, protected. And I was a variable she couldn't fully control. So she poked, not aggressively, strategically. At dinner that night, the long table was set under hanging lights, candles flickering against glassware. Conversations overlapped in comfortable chaos. Plates clinked. Wine was poured generously. It was the kind of scene that felt intimate and celebratory at the same time. I took a seat near the end of the table. Not by accident. The edges had always felt safer. Less visible. Less likely to become a stage. Marissa sat near the center, of course, Kayla beside her. She leaned into him easily, laughing, touching his arm when she spoke. She was radiant in the way people are when they feel secure in the story they're telling about themselves. But every so often, her eyes flicked toward me, checking, measuring. The first comment came lightly. Someone asked about work, making conversation. Marissa answered before I could. "Elena's always been more behind the scenes," she said with a smile. "She likes structure. Simple tasks. It suits her." A few people nodded. Someone said, "That's important too." The moment passed. The second comment came disguised as humor. When someone complimented the event planning, Marissa laughed and said, "Well, not everyone here is built for big-picture thinking. Some of us are better at execution." Her eyes met mine briefly. Just long enough. Still, I stayed quiet. Because silence had always been my shield. And because part of me understood her. Marissa didn't wake up wanting to diminish me. She was protecting herself. Protecting the version of reality where she stayed exceptional and I stayed harmless. But protection, when driven by fear, has a way of turning into aggression without the person noticing. The escalation was subtle enough that no one could accuse her of anything. If I reacted, I would look sensitive. If I corrected her, I would look defensive. She knew that. Whether consciously or not, she knew exactly how to stay just inside the line. During dessert, She stood and raised her glass. To love, she said, smiling broadly. To family, and to all the different ways people contribute. A few laughs, some applause. Then she added casually, some people here run big projects, and some people make copies. The words floated in the air for half a second too long. Eyes turned toward me. Not sharply, not aggressively, just enough. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest. The old burn flaring, sharper this time because it was wrapped in laughter, wrapped in celebration, wrapped in a room full of people who trusted Marissa's framing more than my silence. She smiled as she took a sip of her drink, satisfied. Not triumphant, just relieved, as if she'd nudged something back into place. I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on me, the expectation that I would play my part, smile, shrug, let it slide, and I almost did, because habits that keep you safe for years don't disappear easily. But something had shifted. I could feel it in the way the table went quiet, in the way the laughter didn't quite land, in the way Caleb hadn't laughed at all. He was watching me, not like someone waiting for a punchline, like someone waiting for an answer. Marissa noticed too. I saw it in the slight tension in her shoulders, the way she adjusted in her seat. Her fear stirred, sharp and immediate. She leaned closer to Caleb and said softly, "You know how Elena is. She doesn't like the spotlight." She meant it as reassurance. It sounded like a warning. Caleb didn't respond right away. He set his fork down carefully. He looked around the table once, taking in the faces, the expressions, the fragile balance of the moment. Then he looked straight at me, not with suspicion, not with judgment, with curiosity. "Elena," he said calmly, his voice cutting cleanly through the noise, "what exactly do you do for the city?" The question was simple. That's what made it dangerous. It wasn't framed as a challenge. It wasn't sarcastic. It didn't carry an agenda anyone could point to. It was an open door. And suddenly, the entire table froze. Conversation stopped. Glasses paused midair. Even Marissa went still, her smile locked in place like porcelain. In that silence, I felt the weight of everything I hadn't said for years pressing against my ribs. Every time I'd nodded instead of correcting. Every time I'd chosen peace over truth. Every time I'd let myself be reduced because it was easier than being seen. This was the moment my vow was being tested. The vow I made alone in my car 5 years earlier. I would never beg to be seen again. But this wasn't begging. This was an invitation. And I could feel it clearly now. The moral line I'd drawn for myself wasn't as simple as I believed. Silence had protected me. It had also enabled moments like this. Allowed fear to dress itself up as humor. Marissa's fear. My silence. Both had led us here. Caleb's question hovered in the air, unanswered. And for the first time, I understood something with painful clarity. Whatever I said next wouldn't just change how they saw me. It would change how I saw myself. The room waited. Here's the truth. I wasn't doing paperwork. Not in the way my family, my friends, or anyone at that table believed. Not the dull, predictable, invisible work they assumed I did. For 3 years, I had been the lead investigator on a federal housing fraud task force. 3 years. I spent every workday unraveling lies carefully constructed by people who believed money and connections could make them untouchable. People who thought the law was something that applied to other people. People who had lawyers, influence, and arrogance in equal measure. And I exposed them, one case at a time. I was the person who connected the dots they assumed were invisible. The person who sifted through mountains of data, complex financial trails, shell companies, and coded language. I interviewed witnesses who feared retaliation, analyzed contracts that looked perfectly legitimate on paper, and built cases strong enough to hold up in court. People went to jail because of my work. Not petty crimes. Not small-time offenders. High-stakes fraud. Cases that made headlines in Washington and state capitals. Cases that cost politicians, developers, and corporate executives more than their public reputations. They lost freedom, their networks, their power. And all the while, the people who mattered to me thought I was filing forms, sending memos, and sitting quietly in a cubicle. That's the part you know already. The audience. You. You know I'm not the helper. You know that I wield influence and authority in a world my family can't even see. You know that the quiet, agreeable sister who appears harmless in social gatherings has already changed the lives of people they respect or fear without ever speaking about it at home. They don't. And that's exactly why this moment at the engagement dinner is so sharp, so loaded, so perilous. Caleb's question hangs in the air, deliberate and calm. Elena, what exactly do you do for the city? It's innocent enough on the surface, polite, curious, but beneath it, in that charged silence, it carries the weight of exposure, of risk, of the truth colliding with years of misconceptions. I'm the only one in the room who knows what my answer could do. If I speak now, if I reveal my real role, there's no going back. No going back for my family's perception of me. No going back for the careful identity they've crafted and assigned over the years. No going back for Marissa, whose fear has been the driving force behind her subtle attempts to diminish me. And certainly no going back for myself, because once the truth is out, the version of me that existed in the shadows no longer exists. It's exhilarating, terrifying, empowering in ways I haven't allowed myself to feel in years. I take a deep breath, trying to gauge the room. My mother, oblivious to the stakes, smiles expectantly. Marissa tilts her head, playful, as if waiting for some witty answer that won't disrupt her carefully curated narrative. And Caleb, he watches steadily, calmly, like he knows there's more here than anyone else realizes. The silence stretches. The audience knows I could drop a bomb at any second, and the tension is unbearable. For them, I am still the invisible sister, the quiet helper, the background presence. For you, watching this unfold in real time, I am something else entirely. A force quietly contained, a mind operating at levels my family cannot imagine. I can feel my pulse in my ears. Years of discipline, years of cultivating patience and invisibility have trained me for this precise kind of control. I know how to hold back, to maintain composure, to let someone else unknowingly grant me the power of anticipation. Because that's what it feels like. Power. Absolute, silent power. The kind that doesn't scream for recognition, but demands attention when the timing is right. I replay the moments of my career in my head, like scenes I can't fully share with anyone in this room. The first time I realized the magnitude of what we were dismantling, a housing network that built thousands of families out of basic living rights, exploiting fear, ignorance, and systemic loopholes. The countless nights spent poring over documents until the early hours, cross-referencing every transaction, every account, every signed paper. The sting of watching people who believe themselves untouchable finally face the consequences of their arrogance. And the subtle satisfaction of knowing that those victories never earned me a spotlight at home. That my family, the people who shaped my earliest sense of self, had no idea what I had accomplished, what I had endured, what I had learned. Caleb tilts his head, slightly waiting. His calm, observational presence contrasts sharply with Marissa's performative energy. He doesn't push, doesn't frame the question as a trap, and that makes it infinitely more dangerous. Because now it's my choice. And choices carry consequences. I think about my mother, her casual dismissals. My father, who often didn't see me at all. Marissa, who spent her life trying to stay first, trying to define success in a way that excludes anyone else from the center. And I feel the weight of years where silence was my shield, my armor, my strategy. One word could unravel it all. And I want to say it. I want to let them know who I really am. But the consequences, immediate, visible, irreversible, loom in front of me. If I speak, I will change the room. I will change my family. I will change Marissa. And I will change myself. And maybe, just maybe, the shift isn't something everyone can survive gracefully. It's the kind of moment where every breath counts, where every micro-expression carries unspoken information, where the difference between a smile and a gasp is just a single syllable. And I feel it, the knowledge that even if I choose to stay silent, the moment has already altered the dynamic. Caleb knows now that there is something I am hiding. He senses it. He sees it. And while he may not yet know the depth of it, that awareness alone changes how he looks at me forever. The rest of the table senses it too, though in fragments. The pause, the hesitation in my posture, the way my eyes flick subtly toward Caleb without moving my head too obviously. Small things that, together, create the faintest ripple of unease in a room designed to be celebratory, controlled, perfect. And the audience, watching, understanding, feels it too. They know the secret I carry, the truth that could undo years of careful misdirection, the power that has always been quietly, invisibly mine. And they're waiting for me to decide. Will I finally reveal it? Or will I keep the truth locked away, letting the world continue to believe in the comfortable fiction that has kept me safe? There is no neutral option here. Every choice has consequences. Every hesitation has weight. The longer I remain silent, the more control I maintain, but also the more tense the room becomes, like a coil wound tighter with every second. I glance around the table again, taking in the subtle reactions. My mother smiles, still unaware of the stakes. Marissa fidgets, adjusting a bracelet, her smile a little too sharp, her eyes flicking nervously toward Caleb. The guests murmur, sensing the question's gravity without knowing why. And Caleb, calm, patient, unwavering, waits. I can feel the gravity of it pressing down on me. If I speak, I reveal years of hidden authority, years of impact that no one at this table has even imagined. I reveal a version of myself that could never fit in the role they've assigned me. And I reveal that I've been playing their version of reality all along, quietly, masterfully, deliberately. If I stay silent, I preserve appearances. I maintain peace. I protect the fragile illusions that have allowed my family to feel secure, while I alone carry the truth of my accomplishments. Either choice carries risk. Either choice will change the trajectory of the night, and perhaps much more than the night. And as I sit there, calculating, weighing, feeling the familiar fire of determination rise in me, I realize something else. The secret I've been holding doesn't belong to them. It belongs to me. And for the first time in a long time, that ownership feels absolute. The air is thick with anticipation. The audience, the one outside the room, the one watching silently, knows the truth. They know what I could say. They know how it would hit. And they know that the decision I make in the next few moments will define the narrative that my family has believed for years, and perhaps the story I've been waiting to live for even longer. Caleb leans slightly forward. His question hangs again. Not a prompt to embarrass me, but a deliberate invitation. The kind of invitation that carries consequences, whether I accept it or not. And in that instant, I understand the reality fully. The moment has arrived. The secret I've carried in silence, the skill, the authority, the quiet power, is no longer abstract. It's tangible. It sits in the room with us, between the clink of glasses, the faint hum of conversation, the weight of Marissa's laughter. And now I have to choose. Speak, or stay silent. One will change everything. One will preserve a fragile illusion. Neither is simple. The room waits. And so do I. I hesitated. Not because I feared Marissa. Not because I worried about the judgment of the table. Not even because I doubted my own truth. I hesitated because I feared becoming someone who enjoyed revenge. The thought surprised me. I'd rehearsed this moment for years in my head, imagined it countless ways while walking alone down city streets, during late nights at the office, in the quiet hours before sleep. I picture the shock, the disbelief, the sudden recalculation of everyone in the room. I pictured Marissa's smile faltering, my parents blinking like someone had pulled the rug from under them, the whispers spreading faster than I could speak. And I realized the danger wasn't their reaction. It was me. What if the truth, once spoken, made me feel powerful in a way I wasn't ready to handle? What if the satisfaction of being proven right, of finally being recognized, edged too close to something darker? Something that relished humiliation instead of demanding respect. That line, the one between justice and revenge, between revelation and malice, blurred right there. I took a slow breath, felt the air catch in my chest. The room was quiet, almost unbearably so. Not an empty silence, but the kind where every minor sound becomes amplified. The scraping of cutlery against plates. The subtle hum of conversation that had died off as the last joke landed awkwardly. The faint ticking of a clock somewhere on the wall. Marissa's smile, still perched in place, had tightened imperceptibly. The kind of smile that carries tension in the corners of the eyes. My parents stared at their plates, pretending to occupy themselves while their attention had shifted entirely. Their forks hovered, idle, halfway to mouths that would not taste. My mother's hand twitched toward her napkin as if to steady herself, and my father's brow furrowed slightly, the way it always did when the world contradicted his understanding. Caleb sat leaning forward, palms lightly pressed to his knees, watching with the kind of focus that felt deliberate, even gentle. He wasn't mocking. He wasn't rushing me. But I could feel the weight of his patience, like a scale quietly tipping, waiting to see how I would weigh my own truth against the room. I tried to anchor myself, tried to remember that this was not a performance for anyone else, that what I was about to say was mine, earned and true, regardless of the reaction. And then I spoke. I'm a federal investigator. Simple, understated, flat, no flourish, no hint of triumph, just a statement of fact. The sound barely left my lips before it hit the room like cold water. Time slowed. My mother went pale first. Her hand froze midair, hovering over her empty wine glass. Her lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to protest, to deny the words, to call them back like they had been a mistake. But no sound came out. My father blinked several times, sharply, like the room had shifted beneath him. The plates in front of him suddenly looked heavier. The fork in his hand seemed absurdly large, absurdly mundane, in comparison to what I had just said. He swallowed, a small, audible sound that felt like an admission of disbelief. Marissa laughed, a sharp, unnatural sound. Not a real laugh, not the one that carried warmth, only the mechanical kind that tries to mask discomfort. Okay, sure, she said. Her voice was louder than necessary, carried in the empty spaces where understanding should have been. Her fingers tapped on the table, a faint rhythm that sounded like impatience, or perhaps an attempt to convince herself that what I'd said wasn't true. The other guests shifted in their seats. Some glanced between me and Marissa, unsure where to place their allegiance, unsure whether to smile politely or wait for clarification. Whispers rose, faint but urgent, as people tried to understand the sudden dissonance in the room. Caleb didn't laugh. He didn't flinch. He didn't shift in his seat. He stood slowly, deliberately, a movement that carried authority without arrogance. Every head at the table turned toward him, and for a moment, it felt like the entire house had fallen silent. Even the string lights outside seemed to hum in anticipation, the soft glow over the patio no longer cheerful but expectant. Caleb's eyes locked on mine, not accusing, not patronizing, observing, assessing, waiting for me to clarify, to confirm, to claim the power that I had always carried silently. Marissa's hand twitched toward the center of the table as if to steady herself. Her lips pressed into a thin line. The smile that had protected her moments ago now felt fragile, like it might crack under scrutiny. My mother's knuckles whitened around her glass. My father's jaw flexed as he tried to digest what he'd just heard. The room was no longer a celebration. It had become a theater of suspense, a stage set for a revelation that had already been delivered, and yet had not fully landed. I could feel the weight of everyone's assumptions pressing against my chest. The years of being underestimated, the decades of quiet acquiescence, the countless moments where my presence was minimized, my contributions invisible, my achievements dismissed before they were noticed. All of it concentrated into this single, understated sentence. And I realized something essential in that moment. Revenge would have been satisfying. The desire to make them squirm, to watch them stumble under the truth, flickered briefly like a candle in my mind. But I didn't allow it, because this wasn't about punishment. It was about clarity. It was about truth. And truth, I decided, needed no flourish, no vindictive display, no dramatic retribution. The silence stretched longer. Every second amplified the tension in the room. You could hear the subtle movements, a chair sliding, a breath exhaled, the scrape of a fork against a plate someone barely noticed. I watched Marissa. Her fingers drummed lightly on the table, betraying nerves she tried to mask. Her eyes darted toward Caleb, then to my parents, then back to me. She laughed again, softer this time, a sound attempting to normalize the abnormal, but failing. You're serious? My mother finally whispered, voice tight, strained, as if testing whether the words might vanish if she didn't confirm them. Yes, I said simply. Caleb's gaze remained steady, and then, deliberately, he shifted his stance, standing fully now, the subtle height change giving him a quiet authority that filled the room. I think we need to hear more about that, he said calmly. The simplicity of it was devastating. No exclamation, no accusation, just a quiet insistence that the story continue, that the truth be fully acknowledged. Marissa's expression faltered, the careful mask slipping. Her laughter died. My parents stared, frozen, caught between pride, confusion, and disbelief. And the guests, well, they began to lean in, their curiosity now undeniable, sensing that something monumental had just happened, though they could not yet articulate what it meant. I felt the old tension from years of being underestimated press in, but differently this time. It was no longer constrictive. It was electric, charged, full of possibility. I could stay quiet. I could retreat into the familiar shadows. Or I could speak further, reveal the magnitude of my work, confirm the reality that I had always been more than the role assigned to me. But every option carried weight. Every word would carve a permanent line in the way they saw me, in the stories they told themselves about who I was. And Caleb, standing there, quietly insisting on acknowledgement, made it impossible to dismiss the moment. I swallowed. My hands rested on the table, steady despite the fire in my chest. My parents' faces were masks of conflicting emotions. Shock, denial, uncertainty. Marissa's composure wavered, her carefully constructed identity trembling in place. The guests watched with silent anticipation. And I realized this was the lowest point. Not humiliation, not underestimation, not being overlooked. But the junction where truth, consequence, and restraint collided. Where I had to decide how much of myself to reveal, and whether I would ever let my family see me fully without the veil of their assumptions. I looked at Caleb. His patience, his calm authority, made the choice feel tangible, immediate, unavoidable. And I knew that whatever I decided next would ripple far beyond this room, beyond this evening, beyond the carefully maintained illusions that had kept everyone comfortable for so long. The room held its breath, and I understood, finally, the terrifying beauty of this moment. I was no longer the helper. I was Elena Brooks, and now the question was mine to answer. How much truth could I bear to give them tonight? Caleb didn't raise his voice. He didn't gesture dramatically. He didn't give the kind of speech that makes a room shake with emphasis. He simply looked at me, steadily, with a calmness that felt intentional and powerful. His eyes held acknowledgement, not surprise, not judgment, just recognition. "You led the River's Edge case," he said. The words themselves were quiet, almost casual, but they carried weight the size of a gavel striking a bench. I nodded. Simple, understated. No flourish, no confirmation beyond the subtle, steady motion. The room held its breath. A few guests glanced at one another, their expressions a mix of curiosity and confusion. My family sat frozen, as though the world had subtly shifted beneath their feet. Caleb didn't stop there. He turned slightly, addressing the table without raising his voice, without directing blame, without judgment. "She's the reason my father got his house back after a developer stole it," he said. A hush spread across the room. There was no anger in his voice, no drama, no snide remark about who deserved credit, just truth. The words landed softly but unmistakably. I could feel it, the subtle shift in energy, like sunlight breaking through a dense canopy. 4 years, my accomplishments had been invisible to those who mattered most in my personal life. 4 years, my family had reduced me to paperwork, to the helper, to someone smaller than I was. And in one simple, factual statement, Caleb dismantled all of that. All the assumptions that had weighed on me, the quiet erasure of my work, the years of minimizing myself to maintain peace, they crumbled quietly, without spectacle. He didn't turn this into a dramatic confrontation. He didn't deliver a condemnation. He simply named reality. Then he looked at Marissa. Gently, firmly, without a trace of malice. "You never let her speak," he said. "I should have noticed sooner." His kindness cut deeper than any shouting ever could. Marissa's composure faltered immediately. The laugh she'd relied on to carry the night's performance evaporated. Her hands trembled slightly over her glass. Her eyes, wide and unguarded, flicked to me, searching, grasping for control that had slipped like sand through her fingers. She stood abruptly, the chair scraping the floor, the sound sharp and harsh in the suddenly fragile room. "This was supposed to be my night," she said, voice shaking with the mix of frustration, disbelief, and vulnerability that had been hidden beneath layers of practiced confidence. I stayed seated. Softly, carefully I spoke. It was, until you made me the joke. The words weren't loud. They weren't triumphant. They weren't delivered to hurt. They were calm, precise, the acknowledgement of truth. And in that stillness, something in me unclenched, the tight coil of tension I had carried for years finally loosening. Relief flowed in place of the need for revenge, for dramatic retaliation, for public humiliation in return. The air in the room felt different now. Dense moments ago, it was a weight pressing down from all sides. Disbelief, confusion, unspoken accusations, expectations, and years of quiet erasure. Now it had thinned. Marissa's hands trembled slightly. Her face, which had been carefully arranged into a mask of perfection all evening, betrayed the shock of vulnerability. She looked around, searching for an ally, someone to back her up, but the table remained quiet. My parents, still pale, looked lost and unsure of how to respond. Caleb's calm presence had created a space where honesty and acknowledgement outweighed theatrics and pretense. The moment stretched. I could see her mind racing. A cascade of thoughts. Why didn't anyone ever tell me? How did she achieve this without me noticing? Why now? And underlying it all, the realization that control she had wielded over me, subtly and persistently, was gone. I did not gloat. I did not escalate, because the act of being recognized, publicly yet calmly, was sufficient. I realized something vital in that instant. Power does not require aggression. Authority does not need shouts. Validation does not demand revenge. Caleb's quiet acknowledgement had done more to dismantle years of subtle control than any loud confrontation could have. And it was beautiful in its simplicity. Marissa turned abruptly, her dress catching on the edge of her chair as she pushed back, her hands fisted in the fabric, and for a long moment she stood shaking, unable to find words that could reclaim the narrative. This was supposed to be my night," she repeated, her voice tighter, less composed than before. I looked at her without anger, without triumph, calmly. "It was," I said again, softer this time, "until you made me the joke." She glanced at the floor, swallowed, then pivoted sharply and left the table. Not in anger, not in confrontation, but in retreat, the carefully constructed identity she had leaned on so heavily for years cracking under the weight of truth and quiet kindness. The room exhaled, almost imperceptibly. Guests murmured, some exchanging glances. My parents remained seated, their hands clutching glasses, faces etched with the slow dawning of understanding. Caleb returned to his chair, sitting deliberately, slowly, allowing the energy of the room to settle, letting the moment exist without embellishment. For the first time in years, I could breathe, not in relief of victory, not in satisfaction of revenge, but relief that the truth, simple and unadorned, had been acknowledged, that my quiet years of effort, skill, and resilience had been recognized, not by me shouting for it, not by dramatics, but by someone seeing clearly and stating it calmly. It was a moment of release I hadn't realized I was craving. I looked around the table. The world had shifted subtly, permanently. The balance of perception, carefully maintained for so long, had moved. I had been validated, not with shouts, not with humiliation, but with gentle, undeniable truth. And for the first time, I understood what real acknowledgement felt like. Caleb's kindness had done what anger never could. It had stripped away the pretense, revealed the lie my family had accepted for convenience, and created a space where I could exist as myself, fully, quietly, and without apology. I felt the old tension in my shoulders finally ease. The clenched fists, the tight jaw, the restraint in my throat, all of it began to relax. Relief poured in, unadorned and unexpected, leaving me with a clarity I had never known at family gatherings. Marissa's retreat left a palpable gap, one filled by honesty and quiet power rather than resentment or confrontation. And in that absence, I felt the weight of years of invisibility lift slightly, replaced not by pride, but by calm acknowledgement of what I had endured and achieved. The guests began to adjust. Conversations resumed, though now with a softness, a hesitation, a sense that something significant had occurred. Even my parents' expressions changed gradually, moving from disbelief toward a tentative, almost reverent understanding of the reality they had refused to see. And I sat back, still calm, still understated, letting the moment wash over me. Not as a victory, not as revenge, not as performance, but as relief. Because Caleb had seen me, truly seen me. And in doing so, he had given me permission to finally see myself in the same light. For the first time, I understood that sometimes the most profound acts of kindness are quiet. They do not shout. They do not demand attention. They simply affirm truth. They give permission for others to breathe. And as the room adjusted, as Marissa disappeared into the hall, and as my family struggled to reconcile the evening with the reality I had always been, I felt something inside me unclench, an internal release that no dramatic confrontation or verbal victory could have provided. I realized that validation, when it comes not from anger or revenge, but from calm, truthful acknowledgement, has a power that reverberates quietly yet irrevocably. It does not destroy. It does not humiliate. It does not escalate. It simply resets the world around you, allowing people to see, finally, what was always there. And in that stillness, I understood something essential. I didn't need to prove myself to anyone. I didn't need to perform for recognition. I didn't need to shout or confront. The truth, spoken once with calm clarity, was sufficient. And the relief that followed was more profound than any imagined triumph could ever have been. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to exhale fully, to exist as Elena Brooks, not the helper, not the joke, not the quiet shadow, just Elena. And for now, that was enough. The morning after the engagement party arrived quietly. The house felt smaller somehow, as if the walls themselves were aware of what had shifted the night before. Sunlight slanted through the blinds, slicing across the floor in golden streaks, and the faint hum of early traffic outside contrasted sharply with the heaviness I carried inside. It was a different kind of quiet than I was used to, the stillness of aftermath rather than the enforced calm of my childhood. I sat at the small kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee, my hands wrapped around the warmth of the mug. The events of the night still played in my mind, not like a looping scene from a movie, but in fragments, faces, expressions, tiny moments that had felt monumental at the time. I thought about Caleb's calm acknowledgement, the way he had named truth without drama, without judgment. That single act of quiet kindness had shifted the entire trajectory of my family's perception, and yet the echo of it wasn't just in them, it lingered inside me. By mid-morning, the first messages began to arrive. Short texts from extended family and friends who had witnessed the subtle chaos. Words like, "I didn't know," and "I'm sorry," punctuated with emojis that attempted to soften the awkwardness. My phone buzzed with notifications, and for a moment, I felt a wave of disbelief. Apologies, late and awkward, but real. The recognition I had been denied for years was finally making its way into the world, not with theatrics, but with sincerity. A few hours later, Caleb stopped by. Not to confront Marissa. Not to lecture or defend me. He didn't even mention the party. He came simply to thank me. Not for the revelation, not for the shock, but for the patience, the restraint, and the integrity I had maintained in the face of years of underestimation. "You didn't have to be so calm," he said softly, leaning against the doorway, hands tucked into his jacket pockets. "You could have made a scene. You could have humiliated her." I shook my head. "That's not who I am," I said. "And that's not what I wanted. I just wanted to be seen for what I actually do." He nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "And you were. That's all that matters." His words settled into me. They weren't dramatic. They weren't designed to provoke. But they carried validation in the most profound way possible, acknowledgement without agenda. It was enough. More than enough. Days passed in a subtle rhythm, each one quieter than the last. The usual noise of family dynamics, gossip, expectations, unspoken hierarchies, felt less suffocating. My parents, too, began to shift. Their apologies came in fragments, awkwardly phrased, sometimes halting mid-sentence, as if the weight of what they hadn't seen before made even simple words difficult. "I should have listened," my father said one evening, his voice low and uncertain, eyes avoiding mine as if he was testing the waters of new understanding. I never really realized. I didn't interrupt. I let him finish. "What you've been doing. All these years, he finished, exhaling like he had been holding his breath for decades. I know, I said quietly. No celebration. No grand gestures. Just truth acknowledged. My mother's apology came a day later. Shorter. Fumbled. Honest in its own imperfect way. I didn't see you. I thought I did, but I didn't. And I let it sit. Let it rest in the space where truth and reflection could exist without embellishment. Weeks later, Marissa approached me. No makeup. No carefully orchestrated charm. No smile rehearsed in front of mirrors. Just her, standing in the doorway of my apartment, fingers twisted nervously, eyes vulnerable in a way I had rarely seen. I was afraid of being second, she said softly, almost a whisper. A lifetime of insecurity, carefully hidden behind jokes and jabs, poured into that single sentence. I studied her for a moment. There were no theatrics here, no attempts to control the narrative, no masks. Just honesty. And in that honesty, I saw something fragile and human, the same fear that had driven her to diminish me for years. I was afraid of disappearing, I said back. My voice calm, not accusatory, not triumphant, just steady. My words weren't delivered to shame her. They were offered as acknowledgement, as the truth of my own journey, as the reflection of a shadow I had carried alongside her spotlight. We didn't hug. We didn't declare reconciliation. There was no sudden magical resolution. No sweeping moment that erased years of history. But something shifted. A quiet understanding passed between us. A subtle acknowledgement that we no longer needed to perform for each other, that we no longer needed to lie or pretend. We didn't fix everything. We didn't undo the past. The resentment, the misunderstandings, the underestimation, they weren't gone. Those things take time, and they often never fully disappear. But the lies we told ourselves to maintain comfort had ended. The weight of pretending, of hiding, of minimizing ourselves to appease the world had been lifted. And in that lifting, I learned a lesson I wish I had understood years earlier. Silence doesn't make you kind. Silence doesn't protect anyone, not truly. Silence often erases you. It hides your value. It allows others to define you according to their own fears, their own insecurities, their own convenience. I had spent years minimizing myself, not because I lacked ambition, skill, or courage, but because silence had seemed easier than confrontation, because I believed peace was cheaper than recognition. And while it had kept me safe, it had also kept me invisible. I realized that winning doesn't always look like triumph over someone else. Winning isn't revenge or domination. Sometimes winning is quiet. Sometimes winning is restraint, patience, and truth expressed with integrity. The moral crystallized in the calm of those weeks after the party. You don't need to raise your voice to be powerful. You don't need to shout to be acknowledged. You don't need to humiliate to be recognized. Sometimes, the combination of truth and restraint, observed with patience and intentionality, is more potent than any act of revenge, more permanent, more transformative, and you carry the power, not in proving yourself to anyone else, but in finally allowing yourself to exist authentically, visibly, without apology. I think about Caleb's quiet acknowledgement, about the way he named the truth without drama, without expectation. That single act shifted the dynamics of my entire family, not through force or confrontation, but through recognition. And I understood then that real change, real validation, often comes from unexpected sources, from those willing to see clearly and act with quiet integrity. My family began to adjust slowly, imperfectly. Conversations became more honest, apologies more frequent, acknowledgement more genuine. But it wasn't neat. It wasn't scripted. It was lived in real time, with all the awkwardness, hesitation, and slow learning that comes with human relationships. Marissa and I did not become instant allies. We did not erase our history, but the facade was gone. And in that space, possibility emerged. Possibility to redefine our relationship. Possibility to redefine myself. Possibility to exist without performing for anyone else's comfort. I sat at my desk one evening, reflecting on the journey that had brought me here. The years of being the helper, of minimizing my accomplishments, of allowing fear and silence to define me. The nights of doubt, the moments of isolation, the longing to be seen without having to demand it. And I understood something essential. Self-worth is not granted. It is claimed, not with noise, not with theatrics, not with revenge, but with quiet, deliberate acknowledgement of your own truth. The silence I had once relied on to stay safe had been both a shield and a cage. The moment I allowed myself to speak, with restraint, with precision, the cage began to lift. And in that lifting, I found not triumph over others, but triumph over the fear that had dictated my life for too long. I looked out the window, sunlight falling softly across the room, and realized that the most powerful endings are often understated. They are quiet, they are deliberate, they are lived, and they do not require anyone else to validate them, though when recognition comes, it lands with a force that words alone cannot convey. So here's what I want you, the viewer, to take away. Don't let silence erase your worth. Don't allow the fear of confrontation or discomfort to make you invisible. You don't need revenge to assert yourself. You don't need dramatics to make an impact. Sometimes, the combination of truth and restraint, of honesty and patience, is the most powerful statement you can make. Reflect on the times you've minimized yourself. Reflect on the moments you stayed silent when you deserved acknowledgement. Consider how restraint and authenticity could transform those moments if wielded deliberately. And remember this, your worth is not measured by how loudly you assert it, but by how clearly and truthfully you recognize it yourself. If this story resonates with you, if it reminds you of times you've been underestimated, silenced, or overlooked, take a moment to reflect in the comments. Share your story. Share how you've claimed visibility in your own life. And if you want more stories that explore resilience, truth, and the quiet power of restraint, make sure to subscribe and join this journey with us. Because sometimes the most powerful endings are not dramatic. They are not explosive. They are quiet, reflective, and transformative. And that quiet has the power to change everything. If this story hit something personal for you, like, comment, and subscribe to Vengetaledairy. Share this with someone who's still shrinking to keep others comfortable. And remember, you don't owe anyone the smaller version of yourself. Your story deserves to be heard,